In this question, we're given a graph with some data points on it. And these points show a relationship between the amount of time studying and the mark achieved on a test. If we look at the points, there appears to be a general trend. And that is, as we move to the right, the marks tend to increase. That means, on average, the more time you spend studying, the higher the mark will be. So our assumption here is that this is a linear relationship. And the expectation is the longer you study, the higher your mark will be. So if you increase the amount of time studying, you will also increase your mark. So these two are directly proportional. Now what we have to determine is which point A, B, C, or D represents a student who received a higher mark than expected on a test. Well, let's start. One of the things we can do is break up our vertical axis. For example, we can assume that the best mark you can get on a test is 100%. So if we call this percentage, then halfway down might be 50%, etc. We could put some values in between. And then we could also break up the time axis. It's like assumed to be in hours. So we could say, well, maybe that's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, etc. Okay, now let's take a look at the points. Let's look at point A. So if I drew a perpendicular line to the time axis and then over to the mark axis, we can see that student A didn't spend much time studying, less than an hour, and looks like they got below 50% on the test. So compared to all the other students, student A spent a low amount of time studying and got a low mark. So that is as expected. In other words, student A did not get a higher mark than expected. So we know that A is not the right answer. Let's go to the other extreme. Let's look at student C. So if we drew a perpendicular line down to the time axis and then over to the mark axis, we can see that this student spent a lot of time studying and got a really good mark. So for student C, a lot of time studying and a good mark. Now that is as expected. You'd think that the person spent the most time studying would get a high mark. So it's not a higher mark than expected. Therefore, we know C is not the right answer. Again, even though C got a high mark, it is as expected because that student spent a lot of time studying. Okay, let's take a look at point D, or student D, drawing perpendicular to the time axis and the mark axis. So this student spent a lot of time studying, but just barely passed. So if we put D here, a lot of time studying, but didn't get a good mark. So in this case, student D got a lower mark than expected. You would imagine that if that person studied a lot, they'd get a higher mark. Okay, so let's look at our last option here. We'll look at B. So if we, again, draw lines to the time axis and then over to the mark axis, we can see that this student didn't spend a lot of time studying, not much more than student A, but got a fairly decent mark. So for B, it was not a lot of time studying, but got a decent mark. So indeed, B got a higher mark than what expected given the amount of time spent studying. So therefore B is the right answer. This student got a higher mark than expected on a test.